So what am I supposed to do with this kid, right?
Hey, you're gonna make a lot of money off it.
Well,
Welcome to the Geological Eras Tour. My name is Benjamin Moeller, and I'll be your host. You can support the show and all of the Parent-Teacher Guide to Paleontology on patreon.com/ptpaleo and on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the show. Epitaph 1. What happens when we die? Now, this may seem like kind of a morbid topic to launch a podcast on the back of, but I think it's an important one to address. I'm a paleontologist, which means that I use fossils to study the ancient Earth. Fossils are the remains of ancient organisms that have died and, through a number of geological and mineralogical processes, have turned into stone. And we use those remains to reconstruct not just those organisms, but the ecosystems they used to live in, the climate they used to live in, the geography, all kinds of important things. And if we don't understand how the body changes, not only during but after death, we don't really stand a chance in understanding the limitations of the fossil record itself. So I think this is an important place to begin our conversation. Now, I would argue that in order to die, you need to have been alive in the first place. Science provides a definition of life. In order to be an organism, a living thing, you need to show a certain suite of characteristics. You have to grow. You have to be able to reproduce. You consume nutrients, and you exude waste. You also respond to stimuli. You can move to some extent. Obviously, some organisms, like animals, will move more than plants do, but both do display movement, and they definitely respond to stimuli, things external to them in the environment. So under this definition, we have a whole suite of living things that we find on Earth, not just animals and plants, but fungi and even bacteria, while there are other things like viruses, which only display some of these characteristics, but not all of them, right? The virus can reproduce, but not on its own. They have to hijack the cellular machinery of a living organism in order to reproduce. So when a virus is neutralized or torn apart, I would say it hasn't really been killed, because by definition it wasn't alive in the first place. Now, the manner in which you die is obviously also going to play a factor. There are certain kinds of traumas and diseases that can leave marks on the skeleton, such as bone cancer, or fracturing of a bone, breaking of a bone, even bites that go all the way to the bone. Now, these kinds of traumas can also happen in life, but the skeleton can heal. Therefore, a paleontologist, and more specifically paleopathologist, will examine the bone to determine if there is any degree of healing before death. Death, obviously, is the cessation of any ability of the body to grow or heal. So if a fracture is present, if a break is present, without any sign of healing on a fossil, that means that it should have happened either at the time of death or very shortly before. Within the first few minutes and hours of death, there are 4 different processes that set in pretty quickly: pallor mortis, livor mortis, algor mortis, and the one everyone has heard of, rigor mortis. Now, the first 3 are not really relevant when we're talking about fossils because they concern mostly blood and temperature, right? So pallor mortis is lightening of the skin caused by blood receding from the skin. Livor mortis involves the settling of blood down wherever gravity is pulling it, either on the back if you died on your back, to the front if you died on your front, and so forth. Algor mortis refers to the decrease in body temperature as your inner homeostatic processes shut down and you are unable to have a higher internal temperature than the surrounding areas, or lower internal temperature if you live in a desert like I do. The final stage is rigor mortis, which involves the stiffening of the muscles and the contraction of the skeleton, but it doesn't happen all at once, and it's not just one phase. Signals from the brain are what tell the muscles to contract and hold tension. So when brain activity ceases, as happens after death, there's no longer an instruction for them to do so, and so the body goes limp. The muscles are no longer intentionally contracting. So when rigor mortis sets in, it's actually a chemical depletion of a molecule called ATP, which causes the muscles to start contracting again, and that causes the skeleton to become stiff. Now, if you're a fan of dinosaurs, you may be familiar with something called the death pose, which is a position that some dinosaur fossils are found in, wherein the head and the tail are kind of stretching and curving to meet each other, right? The head kind of curves towards the back, the tail curves towards the front. It's this really interesting phenomenon that's almost kind of beautiful in a ghastly way. There's a very famous specimen of Gorgosaurus, which is a type of tyrannosaurid dinosaur, that's shown in this death pose. There's also a specimen of Ornithomimus, one of the bird mimic dinosaurs, very famously in this sort of curved death pose as well. Now, rigor mortis is not the final stage, because decomposition of the muscles will eventually cause the skeleton to not just relax again, but start to fall apart. So when we see skeletons of animals in the death pose or in a state of rigor mortis, we know that they were buried and fossilized before they had the chance to fully decompose. On a similar note, if you're ever finding a skeleton of an animal or an organism that is articulated, as in the pieces of it, its skeleton, are in the same position they were in life, you know that it was buried and then became fossilized before scavengers or erosion were able to tear the skeleton apart. The vast majority of fossil skeletons are not articulated. They're either partially articulated, as in they had started to fall apart before burial, or completely disarticulated in a just jumble of different bones stacked on top of each other, nowhere near the positions they were in life. And then, I think it's necessary to say, the vast, vast, vast majority of organisms never become fossils in the first place. Their bodies are either consumed or otherwise broken apart well before they have the chance to be buried. I think, if the ancient dead could speak to us, they would tell us that the lucky ones are those who die in a sheltered place, away from the scavengers that come out at night. They would say that the lucky ones are those who are afraid of the worms and not of the insects, and of other creatures that will begin to break you down and lay their eggs before you've even finished dying. Now, just because a corpse has been scavenged upon does not mean that it can't fossilize. In fact, it's not at all uncommon for dinosaurs, or even the mammals that arose after the dinosaurs, to leave behind fossils that contain tiny scratches and tooth marks of different organisms that ate the flesh off of the bones before the bones were eventually buried. There can be much more obvious signs of scavenging as well, and in fact, over the course of the evolution of life, there have been multiple groups that arose that were specifically able to crush bone in order to access the nutritious marrow inside. Modern hyenas are one example of this. But, of course, once you're at the mercy of the osteophages, the bone-eating animals, you're less likely to become a fossil in the first place. The environment that you die in is also going to play a factor. If you happen to die in a desert, a place that's very dry, the body is going to quickly desiccate or lose its moisture. This is actually good as far as preservation goes, because the drying of the corpse slows the ability of microbes to break down organic material, and in a desert habitat where there might be sand or fine particles, the odds of the corpse being buried is actually quite good. If we're talking about an aquatic environment, it can really go either way. If an animal dies in the shallows near the beach, there's a good chance that it's going to be picked apart well before anything can be buried, and even then, the wave action, the rising and falling of the tides, is going to obliterate whatever bits of the skeleton could be buried. Whereas, if we're talking about the bottom of lakes, or even at the bottom of the ocean, the odds are not only better, but actually quite good of preservation in good detail because of something called anoxia. In the water column, there should be overturning circulation in which oxygen-rich waters at the top are mixing with oxygen-poor waters at the bottom. And when this doesn't happen, you get anoxia, where there's a lower layer that doesn't have as much dissolved oxygen, and an upper layer that does. So a corpse that sinks from the top to the bottom of this lake is going to be an environment buried where microbes that are dependent on oxygen are not able to penetrate that deep. They're not able to break that body down. Many of our best preserved fossils were buried in this exact type of environment. As an aside, and this is the case for all of the preservation processes I'm talking about today, an organism does not need to be from this type of habitat in order to be preserved in this sort of situation. There's a well-documented phenomenon called bloat and float, in which an animal can die, and as happens, as it decomposes, the corpse will fill with gas. And if it happens to enter a body of water before that gas filled cavity is punctured, it can then float and travel for a significant distance before eventually, popping and eventually sinking down. An example of this would be the second known skeleton of the therizinosaur or dinosaur Nothronicus, which was known to be from kind of a coastal swampy area, but this particular skeleton was found down at the bottom of the Western Interior Seaway, the Tropic Shale in Utah, an environment in which it certainly was not living. So let's say we have a corpse on land, it's not been totally picked apart by scavengers, and it gets to an advanced state of decay. What happens? Well, there's further breakdown that can still occur, especially to the bones. The skeleton that's inside of you right now, I'm sorry to say, if you had never thought of it this way, your skeleton is wet. And when you die, even if you're not in a desert environment, moisture is going to be lost from the body, right? All your soft tissue will decay away, your squishy organs full of their own special weird liquids are going to be eaten or similarly broken down, and what's left are bones. And when bones dry out, they can flake, they can shatter. So the amount of time that a skeleton spends exposed to the surface elements before burial is also going to have drastic implications for the quality of preservation in the fossils should they ever become fossils. Transport before burial is also a really important factor. So if the skeleton is eventually buried because it's picked up by floodwaters, but those floodwaters are carrying it half a mile, maybe even multiple miles away from the site of death, those bones are going to be tumbled, they're going to get chipped or erode or break a little bit before they're eventually buried in a massive flood deposit. So when we find fossils that are preserved in quite good detail, we know that they were buried quickly and not transported very far from the site of death, if at all. Whereas bones that are in rough shape, they could have spent a long time exposed to the surface, they could have been transported far before burial, and both are in fact possible. So we've discussed what happens to the skeleton before and during burial, but what happens after? That's going to depend on the environment it was buried in, the minerals that are in this same deposit, as well as how long it's been buried and how much weight is stacked on top of the skeleton. We've also spent a lot of time talking about animals with skeletons specifically and not touched on other living things, but don't worry, I'm going to bring those up too. So the corpse is finally buried, and it's buried by sediment, which are small particles of rock that usually accumulate in large amounts and are typically transported either by wind or more often by water. Now, the smaller these sediment particles are, the higher definition, you could say, the preservation of the fossil is going to be. Large particles are not going to have nearly as good preservation as very, very small particles. Stuff like ash is going to be much better than sand, for example. Over time, sediment is going to continue to be deposited on top of this corpse, and that's going to apply pressure. But another important factor to consider is that groundwater, which is able to move through these layers of deposited sediment, is going to be carrying dissolved minerals with it. Because living organisms are built to be able to retain water within us and within our cells, a corpse is going to act as a sponge in these sediment layers in order to absorb that water and therefore the dissolved minerals as well. You may have heard that one of the tricks of the trade that paleontologists use to identify bone versus rock is by licking them, and that's actually not an urban myth. It's true that if you were to put a small piece of most types of fossilized bone on your tongue, it will stick, and that's because the moisture that's on your tongue is sucked into the tiny capillaries that are present inside of what used to be the blood vessels and the marrow structure on the inside of that bone. And the same thing is happening with the bone buried underneath all those layers of sediment. Water is being sucked into it, and those minerals are accumulating and being deposited. To kind of get away from our emphasis on skeletons for a second, I'll point out that wood from trees, does the exact same thing. If you've ever had furniture, which is obviously not living wood, and you've accidentally got water on it, or you've moved to an environment that has high humidity, you'll notice that the wood will swell because it's absorbing water. And this is the exact thing that happens in petrification to create petrified wood. Over time, these minerals will very slowly replace the original organic structure that was there, perfectly replicating what used to be in place, but nevertheless replacing the original organic matter. And so, through permineralization, a formerly organic material can be transformed into an inorganic stone. In a lot of cases, actually, the mineral distortion is so limited that you can actually cut open a bone from a dinosaur or a crocodilian or a mammal, and you can examine cellular structures and growth rings on the inside. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you have crystals that will grow in, and obviously those erupt and change that internal structure that used to be there. So what happens if an organism is buried but it doesn't have a skeleton? Well, other types of animals like mollusks and bivalves, things that have shells as opposed to skeletons, they're still going to undergo mineral replacement, but it looks a little bit different. For example, if the sediments that these animals are buried in contain high levels of iron sulfides, they undergo a process called pyritization, in which the original calcium carbonate shells, be that calcite or aragonite, is replaced with pyrite or fool's gold. If we're talking about plant material like a leaf, after burial they do sometimes keep the original leaf shape, although they will be replaced with a thin carbon film. Large accumulations of plant material, including leaves and stems and wood and bark, will eventually form coal if it accumulates in large enough proportions and is subjected to high enough pressure. And now we've arrived at the part where I get to finally bust one of the most persistent myths about fossils, which is that dinosaurs become coal and oil. They absolutely do not. Sometimes you will find dinosaur fossils and fossils of other organisms inside of coal beds. That does happen. For example, with the exquisitely preserved front half of the skeleton of an armored dinosaur called Borealopelta found up in Canada. However, the skeleton of Borealopelta itself did not become coal, and as a matter of fact, the bulk of coal deposits around the world to this day actually predate the evolution of dinosaurs themselves, back to a period called the Carboniferous. Oil comes from algae and other types of microscopic organisms that accumulate in very large volumes over a very large period of time in seabeds, that over time pressure is able to turn into a very concentrated type of carbon, petroleum, and other types of fossil fuels. Getting back to skeletons, the weight and pressure of sediment on top of fossils can cause them to be distorted as well. In fact, they can squish in certain ways to cause them to take on proportions that the original bone did not have. Evaluating this type of taphonomic distortion is an important part of what a vertebrate paleontologist does, because we're tasked with comparing skeletons of new animals that are found with those of already discovered species to see if we can determine a new type. In modern times, we're able to use 3D scanning and 3D modeling techniques in order to account for taphonomic distortion, and even to mirror elements of which we only know, say, the left side, so that we know what the right side would look like as well. This concludes what I wanted to say on the topic of what happens when we die from a paleontologist's perspective. Now, this is kind of a big and morbid topic, and I certainly remember when I first started thinking about these things as a little kid, it was pretty heavy and caused a certain amount of existential terror. But over time, getting used to the idea that everything dies, to be alive means that someday you will die, and understanding what happens to your remains long after you are gone, it doesn't have to be a scary thing, you know? The weight of existential terror can be too heavy to carry around on your shoulders, but instead you can choose to wear it like a weighted blanket for you to sit under and contemplate as you drift off into your eternal sleep. My name is Benjamin Moeller. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.